And we're now live.
Thank you. So good afternoon and welcome to the City of Brantford's virtual public information session for the 2021 Development Charges Background Study. The city's current citywide development charge bylaw was passed on March 26, 2019. Since that time, Council has approved an updated master servicing plan and transportation master plan, in addition to its adoption and provincial approval of the new official plan, all of which incorporated the boundary adjustment lands from the county. The city has retained the services of Hemson Consulting to prepare the city's 2021 development charges background study. The background study process began with the development and implementation of an area-specific study to review engineered services required for the boundary expansion lands, which was approved by Council on April 27, 2021. The development charge background study has been prepared to address the citywide development charges and includes an update to the area-specific development charges. The development charges background study was proposed and proposed bylaw were posted on the City of Brantford's website on August 27, 2021. I would like to turn this session over to Julia Siraki from Hemson Consulting to take us through a presentation on the development charge background study.
Great, thank you, Judy, and thanks for everyone who's tuning in today. I'll just wait a minute for the presentation to be shown on the screen. Great, thank you. So why don't we just go on to the next slide. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about our overall study process, an overview of our development forecast for the DC study, just a brief overview of our capital programs, the calculated rates, of course, touching on some key policy directions that have been brought forward to the draft DC bylaw, which is available on the city's website, and then finally next steps. So just moving on now. So the purpose of this study is really to calculate both the citywide and area-specific development charges for Brantford, particularly following completion of the city's new official plan, transportation master plan, and master servicing plan. And the process actually began in late 2020, as Judy alluded to, when we initiated the area-specific development charge, or ASDC component of the study to introduce ASDCs for the settlement expansion area lands. And that ASDC bylaw was passed in the spring of this year and is in force. Now, since that time, we've worked through the citywide DC background study, as well as minor changes to the ASDC calculations based on the finalized TMP and MSP details. And through the spring, we've been working closely with department staff to compile historic service level inventories for the general services, which, as required by the DC Act, is required to set up a cap on the amount that can be funded through DCs. At that time, we also worked with planning staff to refine and finalize our development forecasts. And then again, moving into sort of May and June, we were working closely with staff to compile the DC capital programs for each service. Throughout the summer, we completed our DC rate calculations, worked with staff and council to establish policy directions and brought those forward to a council information session. And then finally, the complete DC background study was posted on the city's website about 2 weeks ago on August 24th, I believe. The draft DC bylaw was also posted last week and is available for review. And of course, the bylaw includes both the citywide and the ASDC components and will override the previous ASDC bylaw that was passed in April. And then following this meeting today, we will be moving to the statutory public meeting at council next week on September 14th. And then finally, bylaw passage is targeted for October 26th. So now just moving on to our development forecasts. This is our 10-year citywide development forecast, which was prepared for the purposes of the citywide general services DC calculation. So really what we're looking at here is by 2030, we're looking at an increase of about 7,600 dwelling units or so, census population growth of about 15,600, but population and new dwellings would be closer to 21,000. On the non-residential side, we're looking at growth of about 7,600 jobs, which is associated with non-residential building space of about 500,000 square meters. And then moving on. So as I mentioned, the study included the calculation of citywide DCs as well as the calculation of area-specific development charges in 2 areas. So we have the northern boundary expansion lands, which is shown here in yellow, and then the Tutela Heights area, which is shown here in green. And for the purposes of the engineered services DCs, we actually use a benefiting horizon going out to 2051, which is consistent with the new master servicing plan and transportation master plan. So here we're seeing the 2021 to 2051 forecast for our 2 ASDC benefiting areas. So first of all, on the left, we have the northern boundary expansion lands where we're expecting an additional 7,700 or so dwelling units by 2051 and 23,000 people in those new units. On the non-residential side, we're looking at about 15,000 jobs and 1.3 million square meters of space. And then in the Tutela Heights area, we're looking at just over 1,200 dwelling units, 3,700 people in those units, 90 jobs, and just under 5,000 square meters of non-residential space. And then moving on. Thank you. So we also have forecasts going out to 2051 for the purposes of the citywide engineered services DC calculations and to account for projects that benefit all lands across the city with the exception of the northern boundary expansion lands and the Tutela Heights areas. So we refer to that throughout the study as the citywide excluding ASDC areas benefiting area. And as you'll see later on, the calculated citywide charges are layered on top of our area-specific charges to calculate our full DC rates. So here, looking out to 2051, citywide, we're expecting about 26,000 dwelling units, about 73,500 people in those new dwelling units, about 34,000 jobs, and about 2.4 million square meters of non-residential space. And then when we take out the forecast that I showed in the previous slide for the 2 ASDC areas, in the remainder of the city, we're looking at about 17,500 dwelling units, about 47,000 people in those units, just under 14,000 jobs, and about 1.1 million square meters of non-residential space. So those are our development forecasts. Now moving on, and just a quick note on the historical service levels before moving on to the capital programs. So as I mentioned, the historical service levels set a maximum allowable charge for general services based on the average service level provided in the preceding 10 years. So essentially, this is calculated by multiplying the 10-year historical average service level for each of the general services by the forecasted growth in the 10-year planning period. And that establishes the development charges ceiling, which informs the allocation of costs. And all of those details are included in the background study. I won't get into it in a lot of detail here, just in the interest of time, but they are available in detail on the city's website. So now moving on to the capital programs. So first off, just an overview of the general services capital program. So we have a 10-year planning horizon for the general services, so 2021 to 2030. The key data sources that we used were really the city's 2021 to 2030 capital plan, as well as closely working with department staff throughout this process to identify those projects and costs. So as in accordance with the DC Act, we make adjustments to the capital programs to derive our DC eligible costs. So we make any adjustments for accounting for any grants, subsidies, and contributions. So in this case, we have quite a few Brant County shares of costs as well that we've netted off. We also net off any benefit to existing or replacement elements of projects that are not growth related. We account for any available DC reserve funds or shares of projects that have been funded previously by DCs. as well as what we're calling other development related benefit shares. So those shares are in some cases based on the funding envelope restrictions that I just went over, but also we consider other benefiting horizon considerations, like if a project, if there's a major project, like we have a rec center example, that is expected to serve development going out beyond 2030. So we take a share off to account for that to arrive at our DC eligible costs. So now just moving on. So this is just an overall summary of our general services capital program by service area. Of course, there's much more detail available within the background study itself. Our total general services capital program is just under $273 million in gross costs. So you'll see a lot of that is related to police services, housing, and things like that. Parks and Rec, of course. We've accounted for a total of $44 million in grant subsidies and other recoveries, such as the Brant County shares. And then the third column here shows our benefit to existing share amount, which totals 68 million or so. And then just moving on to the prior growth. So these are shares that were funded previously through DC. So some of our major projects have been in the process of being funded through the DC reserves, as well as any existing DC reserve balances that we apply to projects occurring earlier in the 10-year planning period. So that adds up to about $22 million in total across all the general services. And then the other development related costs that I mentioned add up to about $29 million. So like I said, part of that Parks and Rec particularly is related to the Southwest Community Center, which is expected to meet the needs of the community going out to 2035. So we've removed a significant share of that project to account for that. Otherwise, it is primarily related to the funding envelope restrictions that I talked about. And then after those deductions, we're left with the 2021 to 2030 development related DC eligible amount, which totals about $108 million. And then just moving on to the next slide. So just some of the highlights of the general services capital program, just in terms of some of our most significant projects. So we have the Fire Station 2 relocation expansion. We have the major police service headquarters redevelopment, which is also an expansion as well. We have a new library branch. We have the Southwest Community Center and Park. We have several additions to the transit fleet. We have 476 affordable housing units. So those are accounted for less the Brant County shares, the anticipated grants, and a significant benefit to existing share, recognizing the existing need in the community. So those details are available in the study as well. We have a need of about 640 childcare spaces. So the $7 million there represents the city share of those childcare spaces only. And then of course, much more details available within the background study. So just moving on. So that was the general services. Now moving on to the engineered services capital program, which is a little bit more complex just with the area specific charges. And these are really based off of the city's new master servicing plan and transportation master plan. And a lot of this work was done previously through the ASDC study process. We worked really closely with engineering staff earlier this year to establish those capital programs. As I mentioned, following the passage of the ASDC bylaw, there were some small refinements as the MSP and TMP were finalized. So we have accounted for those and included those minor refinements in our new bylaw. And again, the DC eligible costs are adjusted in accordance with the legislation. So taking off any grant subsidies in this case, in some cases, we have direct developer contributions that are anticipated. Again, benefit to existing replacement elements, any available DC reserve funds, and any other development related shares. And then just moving on. So this is the Citywide Engineered Services Capital Program. So it really represents engineered projects with broad citywide benefit. We've deemed most roads projects to fall under this category as defining those benefiting areas. Roads are planned for on more of a citywide basis, and those benefiting areas are a bit more difficult to define. That's not as much the case for water, wastewater, and stormwater. So in those cases, we have sort of smaller capital programs for the citywide, mostly just dealing with the plant upgrades and citywide studies. Our linear infrastructure is picked up under the ASDC's as well as the citywide, excluding ASDC's areas capital program. So here our total capital program is about $376 million. We have about $3.5 million in grants and subsidies. We take off about 51 million in benefit to existing or replacement shares, about 30 million prior growth, just over 800,000 in other development related costs. And then finally, we're left with about $286 million that is deemed to be associated, DC eligible and associated with growth occurring between 2021 and 2051. So just moving on. So this just gives an overview of the major projects that are included in that Citywide Engineered Services Capital Program. So we have a number of road extension and widening projects. As I mentioned, we have several plant upgrades and master servicing plan updates. Stormwater is quite minimal. We just have the floodplain stormwater management project in there, and the rest of the stormwater projects are considered to be more area specific in nature. And then just moving on. So this is the citywide excluding ASDC areas capital program, sort of in summary. So this is layered on top of the citywide charges for areas excluding the ASDC benefiting areas. So here the total capital program is about $226 million or so. And after making all of the deductions, we're left with just about 99 million in costs that are carried forward to the DC calculation. And then just moving on. So, and then our overview of sort of major capital projects. We have no roads projects. Most of those are included in the citywide. We essentially have a linear infrastructure for water and wastewater applying to this area, as well as a number of stormwater projects. So catchment trunk and local upgrades, flow monitoring and reporting, and watershed studies updates. And then now getting into our two ASDC areas. So the northern boundary expansion lands, as I said, just minor changes from the ASDC study and bylaw. So the scale of the capital program has really not changed too much. So we're looking at about $335 million in total, and about 229 million that's carried forward to the DC calculation. And then again, we do have a couple of minor roads projects here that were deemed to be very kind of localized in nature. And so keeping those in the ASDC capital program will hopefully allow for the city to, will assist with agreements with developers for the funding of those projects. And then again, similar to the previous capital program, we're looking at linear infrastructure and some stormwater projects as well. And then on the next slide, finally, we have the Tutela Heights capital program, where we're looking at about 22 million in total costs, and about 17 million of that is carried forward to the DC calculation. In this case, we have no roads projects again, and then a similar kind of story with the local water, wastewater, and stormwater projects that are included in the capital program. Okay, and then now getting right into our calculated rates. So these citywide rates include the citywide and citywide excluding ASDC areas, capital programs, and the rates are calculated on that basis. Our total calculated charge per single or semi-detached unit is about 38,000. Rows and multiples is about 27,000 per unit. Large apartments is about 20,000, and then small apartments is just under $17,000 a unit. And as you can see in the pie chart, not surprisingly, most of that charge relates to the engineered services and particularly the roads and related charge, as well as larger shares associated with parks and recreation, as well as affordable housing. And then on the non-residential side, we've calculated a charge of about $88.54 per square meter, and even more heavily weighted towards the engineered services. In this case, because certain services like parks and library are considered to be associated with residential development, and no non-residential charges calculated for those services. And then now, so this just shows how the rates have changed. So our current charge, the city's current charge per single or semi-detached unit is about $24,000. We're calculating a charge of about $38,000 per single unit. So a change of about $14,000 per unit. And then on the non-residential side, here, we're looking at a change from the current charge of $79.83 per unit to the $88.54, per square meter. So that's a difference of about $8.71 per square meter. And then just getting into our area specific charges for the northern boundary expansion lands. So again, this includes the layered in citywide charges. And I think I failed to mention earlier that it also includes the city's current parking charge. Parking is being phased out as a DC eligible service, but the city is able to continue to levy for that service until September of 2022. So that's accounted for here for reference as well. So here we're seeing about $56,000 per single or semi, about $40,000 per row or multiple unit, and then about $29,000 per large apartment, $24,500 per small apartment unit. And then on the non-residential side, we're looking at about $151.10 per square meter. And then now our comparison of our calculated versus current. So we're looking at a bit of a more minor increase here because we had calculated the ASDCs previously. So as I mentioned, there's not too much of a change on the ASDC side for the engineered services. So we're looking at when looping in all of the applicable citywide charges, an increase of about $6,200 from the current charge in the northern boundary expansion lands. And then on the non-residential side, we're actually looking at a decrease of about $21.94 per square meter. And then finally, Tutela Heights. So our calculated charges are range from about $48,300 per single or semi down to about $21,100 per small apartment. Again, with the citywide charges layered in, including that parking charge. And then moving on to the non-residential charge, which is $141.36 per square meter. And then next for our comparison, so compared with the currently enforced Tutela Heights charge, including all citywide charges, again, we're looking at an increase of about $9,300 per single or semi-detached unit. And then on the non-residential side, we're looking at a decrease of about $7.78 per square meter. And then now finally kind of getting into some rate comparisons with sort of neighboring municipalities as well as comparable municipalities, particularly those that have comparable area-specific charges for greenfield areas. This is kind of where we're sitting. So all of our Brantford charges are in sort of the green here. So you'll see that the citywide charge is kind of comparable to Brant County, a little bit higher on the higher end there. It's a bit lower than the Peterborough when we account for the lift lock area specific development charges. The Tutela Heights charge and the Northern Battery Expansion Lands charges are somewhat comparable to what has been calculated in Windsor's Sandwich South area, also comparable to Cambridge's charges, kind of town-wide, and then as well as Hamilton's charges as well. And then on the non-residential side, we're similarly for the Brantford citywide charges are coming out a little bit higher than Brant County's current charges. And then on the area specific side as well, a little bit lower than Windsor's area specific charges. So that's kind of what we're looking at there. And then we have accounted for some changes in terms of policy and administration within our DC bylaw. So a few really key changes here have to do with discounts and exemptions. So first off, we are removing the residential infill area discount. We're also discontinuing the stormwater charge for the intensification area that's included in the current bylaw. There currently is no listing of intensification projects, so that was deemed to be not appropriate to carry forward with at this time. It's proposed to continue the existing affordable housing exemptions, as well as the downtown exemption area, although we have included a clause within the draft bylaw that allows that exemption to continue until the city introduces an alternative mechanism. So the city might choose to pursue a community improvement plan option for that exemption area with some additional study. So until that time, that downtown exemption within the DC bylaw will remain. No changes in terms of the date of indexing of the charges. So those will be indexed on January 1st of each year. And also, we're not proposing any changes at this time to the local service policies and guidelines, although those can be reviewed and updated at any time outside of the DC process. And so staff may wish to continue to examine that, particularly as those ASDC areas move forward. And then just to wrap up with a review of our next steps. So we have our statutory public meeting at next week's council meeting on September 14th. We will be available to respond to any stakeholder or public submissions during this time ahead of the target bylaw passage date of October 26th. And then just the next slide. So that really concludes our presentation. Thanks very much. Key project team contact information is provided on this slide, and we're happy to take any written comments over the course of the next few weeks. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks so much, Julia, for your presentation today. So I just wanted to thank you for coming. And then we'll just conclude our meeting. We had no registrants to speak at today's session and no questions were submitted in advance. So this will conclude our virtual public information session. Thank you very much.
And I've ended the live stream on YouTube.